Well, I think I'm live. This is the second of these short talks I'll be giving direct to camera, whatever you want to call them. They're not podcasts, are they? That's something different. Anyway, me live on YouTube. When I've got the hang of all this, I shall start scheduling when I'm going to do these. I'm not quite sure what the best time is. I might regularly do them every week, say on a Sunday afternoon, UK time, at around about 5 p.m., which would be midday on of Eastern time, and where would it be? Central time, it would be it would be 11, and so on. Even in Pacific time, it would be 9 in the morning. So people would be up and around. Okay, let us have a look. I'll answer questions at the end, but if I see anything that sounds really fascinating, I'll answer it as I go through. Kasun Lee, he is there. Hello, sir. I don't know who else will be watching this live, maybe a few eventually, but I don't expect that many will come and watch it live because I didn't know I was going to do it. I'm just finding time in between all sorts of other things to do them at the moment. But anyway, that's the last talk I gave a week or two ago was about how the background to the whole Strange Fate story. This is and how the Greenstone events took place, which is a sort of background to the whole thing. But the story itself in the book, the true story in Strange Fate, that was written by Jodie Russell and myself, is all about the weird things that we experienced over a couple of years of investigation into this group called the Order of Meonia, a group who were involved in the paranormal, involved in mysticism in the mid to late 19th century that consisted mainly of women. Now, the head of this group in the night around 1870 was a woman called Mary Heath. And it was with her that this group that went on to do some quite extraordinary things, which I shall talk about in later talks like this. It was with Mary Heath that this Order of Meonia, or the Meonia group, first began. Now, what we discovered from various writings by people in 2 or 3 various families involved in the whole thing that have been preserved over the years, but not intact. So we've had to sort of put together a lot of put together the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, if you like, of various word of mouth accounts of what happened, passed down through generations. But we have found enough evidence to suggest a fair outline of what happened in May the 4th, actually, in 1851. Now, Biddulph Grange in northern Staffordshire, on the edge of an area called the Peak District, hilly moorlands in the northern Midlands, Biddulph Grange Estate once covered quite a large area. It was a Victorian mansion built by a family called the Batemans in the mid-19th century. In 1851, it was owned by a James Bateman and his wife, Maria. And they were industrialists. I won't bother going into the full details of their business, but they were involved in coal mining and iron production, this sort of thing. So they were new money. They weren't aristocrats who could date themselves back to the Vikings or something. And you'd also got another family who lived a couple of miles away at a place called Clough Hall, who were the Heath family, a man called Robert Heath, his wife, Anne. They were also industrialists in the same line of business as the Batemans. And so they had a lot of business interests together. So they were kind of business partners, if you like. And in 1851, on the north of the Biddulph estate, about 2 or 3 miles from the actual house itself, there was an old stone circle, possibly dating back 3,500, 4,000, maybe even 5,000 years. A lot of the stone circles in Britain date back to that sort of time. I mean, Stonehenge is the original stones of Stonehenge probably were put there around 5,000 years ago. So we're talking of a stone circle smaller than Stonehenge of about 10 stones, and next to it, an old burial mound. But for reasons I'll be explaining in another short film I've made that I'll be uploading soon to YouTube, that the tomb doesn't seem to be as old as the stone circle itself. That appears to be about 1,500 years old. Give you some kind of background to that. 500 AD is after the Romans had left Britain, but before the Anglo-Saxons invaded this country, well, fully anyway. And it was the period in which the stories of King Arthur are set. I know we see him on the TV as being a character in shining armor from the Middle Ages, but in reality, he'd have been dressed more like a Roman soldier, and his defenses would have been wooden stockades and earthen embankments rather than huge Gothic castles. It's just that stories about him were written in a time of huge Gothic castles and knights in shining armor. So what they did was they set the story in their time. Anyway, that's just a bit of a background to the period of time that the tomb seems to date from. Now, in 1851, it was a stone chamber filled with, covered with earth, rubble, and eventually grass to look like a mound with a small entrance that would once have had a stone over it. It had been robbed out over the years by treasure hunters and all sorts of people, so it wasn't really expected to be anything of value inside it. But Robert Bateman, who owned the property, got his cousin, who was Thomas Bateman. He was an archaeologist, and he had a friend called Carrington, and they worked together on tombs, digging up old tombs and other archaeological excavations. And he basically, together they decided to excavate this tomb. The idea was to dig down in the soil to some distance, maybe 2 or 3 feet, maybe even deeper, to see if there was stuff there, like pottery fragments from which they could date the tomb, rather than, expecting to find any jewels or any grave goods that may have been left behind. They would have long since gone. But fragments of pottery wouldn't be of interest to treasure hunters, but they would be to an archaeologist. So they were going to excavate the site. While they were doing this, the son of James Bateman, Robert Bateman, who was, I think, 9 then, a little boy, and a little girl, the daughter of the Heath family, the daughter of Robert and Anne Heath, Mary Heath, she was 7, were playing around the area. And in the archaeological report that Carrington and Thomas Bateman wrote, they talked about the children getting in the way, and they eventually had to rope off the area to stop them interfering with the dig. But what happened was that little Mary was just an ordinary little girl at the time, crawled in to this little hole, I suppose it was about so big, at the side of the mound into the tomb. So she kind of crawled through this hole into the tomb and came out very different. When she came out, she opened her hand and produced a small stone heart. Now, this was about so big, 2 inches high, 2 inches wide, roughly made of what appeared to be rose quartz. Now, she said she'd found it. She was in this place on her own in this little tomb for some minutes. She'd apparently sort of dug down with a stick or something in a certain part of the tomb and located this stone, which had all soil all over it and appeared to be just some ordinary pebble, which is perhaps why it had been overlooked. And Thomas Bateman, the archaeologist, immediately thought, "Wow, this is interesting. Could this be help us to date it?" Well, nearby, about 7 miles away in a town called Leek, Carrington and Thomas Bateman had conducted another excavation of a tomb where a small stone heart had been found there. But there it was actually discovered inside a pottery vessel, a jar, if you like, that could be dated, because of the style of pottery, it could be dated to around the year 500. And so somehow the people of Britain at that time, probably pagan Celts in that part of the country that may have come from Ireland originally, seem to have had this tradition of burying the important people, priests or priestesses, in a grave, and then having a pot and putting this small stone heart in with it. Now, it seems to be unique to that particular part of the country in North Staffordshire. In fact, that very specific area, which is known as Wolfside. So, okay, so she comes out with this stone that she finds, and she just said she felt like she had to dig in that place to find it, which was peculiar to the people that were there, her parents and the Batemans, and saying, you know, how did you know? She said, I just knew. But what's more than that, she had a load of different, she was full of accounts of the fact that while she was in there, she had like a strange dream in which she was in another world, and she couldn't explain it because there were strange creatures. Unfortunately, we're not told exactly what these strange creatures were, or the details of these visions or dreams. But it seems that most people at the time just took it to being a child imagination. But it was quite strange that she'd been able to find this stone. But just after she came out of this tomb, in the days that followed, she started telling people things about themselves that there was no way they could have known. In other words, she seemed to have become psychic all of a sudden. She seemed to become like a medium. So this little girl of 7, who was quite normal in every other way, she hadn't changed apparently. She didn't go around like some sort of ghost girl or some sort of zombie. Kellyanne. Oh, Kelly, hi, how are you? Sorry, I'll just have to keep going with this talk, but any questions I'll answer afterwards. Shinny G, hi, Graham, great to catch you live. Hello there. So this little Mary Heath was considered, people began to believe that she really had gained these like psychic powers. She could tell people things about themselves that she shouldn't have known. She'd become like a medium, if you like. Now, whether how much that is true or how much they were just fooling themselves with, no way of knowing. But eventually she did something which originally her parents were fairly convinced that she'd become different after she'd gone in this tomb and become psychic. But not just that, but there was quite a few people who believed her and quite a few people that didn't. And amongst those that didn't was James Bateman, who was the owner of the property upon which this thing was found, this heart was found, and the little girl had seemingly become psychic or whatever had happened to her. But she said she could prove it. And she led these adults to the other side of the Biddulph Grange estate, where she said there was an old ruined priory there, an old chapel dating from the Middle Ages that used to belong to the Knights Templar. Won't bother going into all what they were, most people know. And she suddenly went to a corner of these old ruined walls, said if they dug down there, they'd find a stone slab. And if they removed that, they would find a underground vault in which was kept a number of things that the Templars have long ago hidden, and manuscripts sealed in lead containers. Now, according to the writings of Maria Bateman, that's James Bateman's wife, this is exactly what happened. She even drew a series of pictures of the excavation there. I've put some of them up in the past. You've probably seen them. Maria Bateman was quite an artist. And And the little girl, she was right. They dug down and they found this stone slab. They moved it. There was some old steps below. It seems like it hadn't been disturbed in centuries. And they did find old Templar graves there. The actual graves, because the area was open to vandalization and so forth. James Bateman at this point is totally convinced that this little girl is able to do miraculous things. He has the Templar gravestones moved to a nearby church called St. Lawrence Church in Biddulph, and they can still be seen today all around the outside of the church. It seems that the Templar bodies were actually buried somewhere in the graveyard, and just the coffin lids were placed around the church. And today they're rather unceremoniously being used as benches. That's just weird. But anyway, so they also found a lot of other stuff in there, and seemingly manuscripts and amulets that had been used by people in the past to do with alchemy and mysticism and this sort of thing. What exactly these were, we're not given a full a description, only that there were sacred items. It could be anything. But this began, Maria Bateman was so overwhelmed by this little girl that they decided to start this secret society. And the idea of it was to try and utilize or use the mystical knowledge that they'd found in this tomb, or that Mary had led them to. Also, this small stone heart that they called the Heart of the Rose suddenly started doing some rather weird things itself. I'll come on to that on my next talk about, talk to camera like this. And because of all this, they decided that little Mary was very special, but she was too young to lead some kind of occult group. The men in these families, like James Bateman, he spent most of his life traveling the world. He was rich enough. His father had made all the money. He didn't have to do anything. So he traveled the world. He had a fascination for botany, and he wanted to create these wonderful gardens around his house. And he did do in the end, but he was traveling the world, sending the plants from around the world back in the form of seeds or cuttings or saplings back to England to have them planted by a whole army of gardeners around Biddulph Grange. His wife, Maria, was left behind to kind of organize this gardening, built a series of strange shrines or temples, if you like, in the grounds of Biddulph Grange. I'll be coming onto that in another talk. And started this group, the Order of Meonia, to practice these age-old mystical beliefs. I mean, just to give you some idea, one of these tombs was a recreation of a Roman tomb, a Roman temple. There was a recreation of an Egyptian tomb, a Chinese sanctuary and pagoda shrine, and a Celtic glen and holy well. So they were kind of hedging their bets using all sorts of different forms of mysticism to achieve an aim that took us quite some time to figure out what exactly they were intending to do with all this. But anyway, I have to just now, to finish this off, go back to little Mary. Her full name was Mary Ann Heath. She liked, apparently, according to people around her, to be called Mary Ann. So about 3 or 4 months, so this was May the 4th that she'd made this discovery during the time of the excavation of the Bridestone's tomb. It was in August, the following end of July, August, Robert Heath and his wife Anne, with their daughter Mary Ann, she was the eldest daughter, the eldest child, they went to stay at the home of a man called Lord Halifax. Now, he lived in southern Yorkshire, further up north in England, and he owned vast areas of land. And the Bateman, Robert Heath, Anne Heath, was staying with him so that Robert could discuss mining rights, coal mining rights in the area. And they stayed there for some weeks, and they'd taken little Mary with them. Now, it was at this time that Mary met a very interesting person, none other than Lewis Carroll. His real name was Charles Dodgson. Lewis Carroll was the name pseudonym he used to write the stories under. He was a young man at the time, employed by the Halifax family as a tutor to the children. And I think one was there's only one was a boy of about 6, I think. There was a girl of 12, and I think there was a toddler or a baby. But mainly it was a tutor for the older girl who was 12. Now, Mary was staying there at exactly the same time over this summer of 1851, when Lewis Carroll was acting as the tutor to the children of Halifax. Presumably must have met little Mary Heath. And it just happens that it was at exactly that time that he first came up with the idea for the stories of Alice, both of them through the Looking Glass and Wonderland in tandem, although he didn't publish them for many years later. He wrote notes, he drew original illustrations of what he thought Alice should look like. And he actually insisted, when the book was eventually published, that the illustrator copy these pictures almost exactly. Because, he said, he always said that he'd based this child, the Alice character, on a real little girl. Now, later on, the name Alice came from the daughter of a man he worked for. In later life, when he wrote this, when the stories were published and he finished writing them, he was at Christchurch College, Oxford University. He was a tutor in mathematics, a lecturer in mathematics. And there was the guy who was his boss, the dean of the college, whose daughter, Alice Liddell, he dedicated the book to. Now, many people said, oh, well, he dedicated the book to Alice Liddell, so he must have based the girl upon her. Well, no, because Alice Liddell wasn't born when he first came up with the idea of the story. And second, she looks nothing like the pictures. I mean, the pictures of Alice he drew, she has this long blonde hair and so forth. Alice Liddell had like bangs, or a fringe as they call it in England, and a bob haircut. And she was 12 when the story was published, whereas Carroll specifically says in the book, the first book, Alice in Wonderland, Alice is exactly 7.5 years old. Now, and he always claimed that he was inspired to write this story by an unusual little girl he'd met. The only child of 7.5 years of age he met at the time he came up with these ideas was Mary Heath. So it seems that he based the whole idea of Alice from Mary Heath. Now, remember, she'd actually really crawled into this small hole in the earth and into this underground tomb, come out saying that she'd seen all sorts of strange things and seemingly had mystical powers. Well, isn't that like Alice crawling into the rabbit hole and visiting the Wonderland with all these strange beings? Anyway, so there's a whole host of reasons for believing that Mary Heath inspired the character of Alice in Wonderland. One of the very interesting things is that at the beginning of the story, over and over again, I think it's on 3 occasions, maybe 4, can't remember quite, the White Rabbit calls Alice Mary Ann. Follow me, Mary Ann. Now, in the story, Mary doesn't know why he's calling her that. He thinks she's a servant, but no character like that comes into the book. Mary Heath's name was Mary Ann. So it's possible he was leaving a cryptic message, if you like, in there to lead people maybe one day to know who the real Alice was. But I'll leave it there. And the next talk, some of you have already seen the video I made about the Alice through the looking glass and how Mary Heath ties up with that, and a very weird story indeed. But that I shall cover in the next installment, or whatever you call these things. But all I wanted to talk about today is how the Order of Meonia got started. This 7-year-old little girl who was quite normal, as far as we know, wanders into an underground, 1,500-year-old underground tomb, finds this item called the Heart of the Rose, which is supposed to be some ancient talisman, which was lost later on or hidden. And myself and Jodie spent a long time searching for this to see if it did have any strange supernatural properties. This little girl inspired this group of called the Meonia group, or the Order of Meonia, around Biddulph Grange starting in 1851 in May, and the building of all these strange temples in the gardens of Biddulph Grange that are still there today. So that is me done for the moment. Let's have a look who's there. Casson, yes, he's still there. Sheeny Gee, still there. Kellyanne, hi Graham, hi all. Absolutely fascinating. I'm so grateful to have your book. Oh, well, thank you very much for buying the book. Shinny, what are your thoughts on Emma Britton? There's an Emily? There's an Emily who was remember I said there was a 12-year-old daughter of the Earl of Halifax who was too old to actually have been the Alice because she was 12. Her name was Emily. I don't know who Emma Britton is actually, but maybe I should. But I'll have a look. Maybe I can find out online who is Emma Britton. Emma Britton. Don't say I don't do my research thoroughly. I have no idea who she is. Emma Britton. Oh, is she? Emma. The University of Manchester. I don't know. She seems to be an academic by the look of this. Most awarded mattress maker. No, that's not her. Miss Great Britain. Emma Britton. Sorry, I have absolutely no idea who she is. But if you want to send me a message, I can answer that if I know who she is. There's a 5-minute or so video of Alice Liddell in her older years talking about Carol. Oh, that's interesting. I'll actually have a look at that. I think I did see it some years ago. So there are certain aspects of the story that when he actually came to write it, that he did take from Alice Liddell. For example, towards the end of the Looking Glass story, he puts a conundrum in there, which is like a poem, and each letter of the poem, the first word of each line, spells out Alice Pleasance Liddell. So he's clearly dedicating the book to her. He did dedicate the book to her. He brought her into it. It may be just to have pleased his boss. Alice's father, who was dean of his faculty. At some point they fell out and had nothing to do with each other anymore. On YouTube, I'll have a look at that. Thank you, Casson. Hi Graham, great talk. Thank you, Gary. Emma Hardinge Britton. I have no idea who she is. Britain. Oh, it's spelled like that, is it? Hold on, I'll have a look again. I was looking for it as in the country. What does she do? Oh, she's some English advocate of the early modern spiritualism. She hasn't come into it yet. She's living at exactly the right time. So she was born 1823, was a leading spiritualist, died 1899. Yeah, she's exactly the same generation as all these others. Thanks for mentioning her. I'll look into her. They were definitely involved in spiritualism. One of the people that was involved in the group was Evelyn de Morgan, a pre-Raphaelite painter, who was like, her and her husband were way up high in the spiritualist movement. I'll have a look at Emma Hardinge, Britain. I'll definitely look at that. Orpher Circle, that's what she was part of. Right, we'll look into that. Medium was Helen Vatsky. Oh, right, so she was part of Helen Blavatsky's thing and then broke off and started her own. That's very interesting. There's definitely, there's quite a few people who were involved in the Meonia group, or we certainly suspect those who were definitely involved, including Florence Farr, who was part of the Golden Dawn and later founded a group called the Sphere group, whose job they were trying to raise up an Egyptian princess or something. But that's another story. That was what inspired Bram Stoker to write Jewel of the Seven Stars. That Emma Hardinge Britain was discussed by dark journalists, which you can find on YouTube. Okay, will do. Magic mushroom after using. Yeah, I'm not quite sure if. Yeah, the thing is that these people who were involved in these groups did claim to have all sorts of weird things happen to them, but you don't know what they were taking in. People in Victorian times were taking laudanum for breakfast. And I mean, opium was freely available. At the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century, there was no regulation on what people could eat or drink or whatever else. And one of the things that was really popular after Madame Curie's discovery of radium was to have radium drinks. They crush up radium rock, radioactive rock, shove it in some fizzy water, and it was supposed to do you good. So God knows what. So you can't take 100% what these people say they saw or did as real, but certainly when you have somebody who is clearly not going to be involved in that, taking those kind of weird things, like a little girl like Mary Heath, and she can prove herself by saying, dig there and you'll find something, that's pretty impressive. He believed that based on her and made a good argument for it. Who believed who was based on what? Sorry. Hold on. Somebody, Shiny Gee says he believed the Alice character was based on her and made a good argument for it. For Alice Liddell or Mary Heath or the medium Emma. The dark journalist, right? Who did he think was Alice? Emma, Mary, or Alice Liddell? I'll look at it myself anyway. I'll look into that. But she may have been based on a number of different characters. But what's interesting, when he first came up with the idea, the only person that was kicking around was Mary. Okay, Emma Britton. So she was born in 28. Mary was quite old, a lot younger than her. Emma Britton, when he first came up with the idea, he came up with it in 1851. She'd have been in her 20s then. Oh, well, I'll have a look and see what the dark journalist says, whoever he is. Sounds interesting. Or she. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. And I shall be doing another one of these. I'll try and advertise when it's going to be, but I never know when I'm going to be free. But I might try and do it on a Sunday afternoon at 5 o'clock. If anybody likes that idea, just say yay. Okay, then. Bye for the moment. End stream. Edit. What do I do? Just click end. End.